Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Casual Criminalist. This one, as always, written by Kevin. Well, not as always, actually. Multiple writers write this. It's always read by me. I'm Simon. Kevin writes it. I've never read this before. It's Russia's most prolific serial killer, the Chessboard Killer. Brilliant. If he's like carving chessboards into people, I'm going to be like flaying the skin off the white square for the dark squares. I'm going to be really upset. I really hope it's not that. Wait, what else could he have done? Where's this going, Kevin? Let's jump in. I've loved chess for as long as I can remember, despite not being very good at it. Me too, Kevin. At a time of writing, the FIDE World Championship just finished. Oh my gosh, that's probably a while ago, wasn't it? I think I remember hearing about that. That was a long time. This script's been here for a while. Sorry, Kevster. And the fact that the game started at 4 a.m. here on the East Coast may or may not have completely destroyed my sleep schedule more than it usually is. Yeah, the idea that I'd get up, I mean, I get up at 5, so it's not that bad, but not to watch chess. I don't think there's anything I like enough to get up at that time in the morning. I don't think there's any entertainment that entertains me enough. I'd get up to work, but that's about it. Many of you may think that watching a 5-hour classical chess game is a good way to put yourself to sleep, and it largely was. A few of the games did manage to be really exciting, though I was a bit annoyed to fall asleep near the end of game 14 when the position was a dead draw, only to wake up and find out that one of the players blundered, and we now have a new world champion. Oh, blundering at that level of chess. Ooh, don't do that. Anyway, a big part of why I never got very good at chess is that I really didn't have anyone to play with growing up. Wait, you could just play against the computer. Even I had the computer playing chess. You know, the one that it's like pawn to e6, and then you have to move its pawn to e6. And then you have to go, and it just whipped my ass it had 10 levels. I don't think I ever made it beyond like level 5. It's like beyond that, it just whip my ass.
The first chess game that not only thinks, but also speaks to you.
I am Fidelity Chess Challenger, your computer opponent.
Now, fascinatingly, the best chess engine in the world, I think, is called Stockfish, and it's literally, you can't beat it. It can run on it can probably run on your phone, I don't know, but it just crushes it will crush every grandmaster. I imagine that if all the grandmasters in the world got together and had infinite thinking time, they'd probably still get crushed by Stockfish. Maybe. Who knows? Not an expert, but it is interesting that now, you know, what required Deep Blue to do to beat Garry Kasparov or whatever back in the 80s, it's now like, oh yeah, no, you could probably run that on your Apple Watch. The only real practice I got was in high school, and no, I was not a member of the chess club, just the maths team. One of my friends would bring a chessboard to school so he could play during study hall, and sometimes during English class. But there are lots of things you can do with a chessboard beside play chess. Most obviously, you can also play checkers. Or you can teach somebody about the concept of exponential growth by putting an item on square 1 and then trying to double the number of items on each subsequent square. You can even whack your classmate in the back of the head with it if the teacher isn't looking. Yeah, exponential stuff's crazy. How big? It must be absolutely, I don't know how big on square 64, but it's going to be massive. For Alexander Pichushkin, however, his prize chessboard was used to keep track of the number of murder victims. Oh, okay. Oh, good. He's only tracking his 64 murders. He's not carving a chessboard into someone's back. Oh, thank God. I was really worried today.
Oh, thank God for that.
64 people. Holy shit. His goal was to fill all 64 squares with victims and beat out Andrei Chikatilo. Made a video about him. F***ing psychopath. For the title of most prolific serial killer in modern Russian history. Early life. Alexander Pichushkin was born on April the 9th, 1974. We've covered a lot of murderers on this channel, and there's usually some sort of horrific backstory, so much so that don't fuck up your kids is one of the most important rules here on Casual Criminalist. However, that's not really what happened here. Alexander's father was a worthless drunk who abandoned the family when Alexander was only 9 months old, but having no father is almost certainly better than having a drunk and abusive father. His mother is also sometimes described as neglectful, though I'm not entirely sure how fair that is. She was a single mother, raising a child, and also trying to find a new husband, so of course she was going to be very busy. God damn. I guess I always respected like single mothers. I'm not one of these people who was like, oh yeah, that sounds easy. I was always like, it's probably quite difficult, isn't it? And then I had kids, and I'm like, God damn, raising kids as like a as two adults is already hard. Doing it yourself, one person, I'd be like, well, I guess I just don't work then. But somehow people make it work. Crazy.
Stu, what are you doing?
Making chocolate pudding.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning. Why on earth are you making chocolate pudding?
Because I've lost control of my life.
I don't know, man. That's fucking tough. As far as I can tell, she was a loving parent, and by all accounts, Alexander was a happy and normal kid with a normal childhood. Had nothing gone wrong, it's suspected that he would have led a quiet and peaceful life, but something did go wrong. Although, what happened probably wouldn't be anywhere in your first 1,000 guesses. I don't know, let me guess. I'm gonna take a guess. He decides that he's going to track his murders on a chessboard. Maybe that's not it. Maybe there's something that actually led to that point. There's probably, between A and Z, there's probably a whole bunch of other steps. Now, the major turning point in Alexander's childhood wasn't some act of abuse or witnessing something truly horrific that broke his psyche. Instead, it was a fairly ridiculous accident that sounds like it came straight out of a Charlie Brown cartoon. Oh no, is he going to have like a knock on the head? He's like, yeah, no, I just like chess and I'm having a good time. My mother is loving. I'm having life is good. And then he gets bang on the head and he's like, nah, I'm a psycho. I'm going to fill that chessboard with bodies. When Alexander, no, it really is this. When Alexander was 4 years old, he was playing on a swing. Oh no, he's going to fall off a swing. And it turns him into a psycho. Fuck. However, he went too high and fell backwards off the swing. I just... We were putting some play stuff in the garden for our kids. And my wife was like, should we get a swing? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, okay, cool. I look into the swings. And I'm like, none of these are big enough. And she's like, they're massive. How big do you think these kids are going to get? I'm like, it's not for the kids. I love a good swing. So we had it's like 3 meters tall. It's this giant metal structure that has a huge swing on it. And it's like fully possible. And I think it really is a swing for adults. But my kids also love it, and you can go so high. Hopefully my kids don't fall off and become psychopaths. Alexander wasn't injured, so he quickly stood back up just in time for the seat to swing back down and hit him directly in the forehead. Oh, dude. We often think of children as being made from rubber because compared to adults, they are. Children's bones are much more flexible than the bones of adults, which makes them less susceptible to breaking. Unfortunately, they also aren't as strong, with a child's skull only being about 1/8 as strong as an adult's. Wait, what sort of age of child? How old was he? 4 years old. Oh yeah, 4's really small. I can't imagine my son, who is 3, can't imagine that his skull is particularly strong. My daughter's skull, who's 5, I think her skull is probably substantially stronger. According to experts, it's believed that this blow to the head caused damage to the frontal cortex of Alexander's brain. Damaging this part of the brain can result in aggression and poor impulse control, and Alexander's mother immediately noticed a change in his behavior. He had once been a friendly and sociable child, but after the accident, he became aggressive and impulsive. That's so intense. Can you imagine? I just imagine it in my own garden. I'm a kid going out playing. He's like, wee, dad, look at me. Bang, and he knocks his head on the swing. It doesn't seem that bad. You're like, oh my God, are you all right, Romulus? And that's what I call my kids. My kids are called Romulus and Remus, at least for the purposes of the internet. Are you all right, Romulus? And he comes inside and he's just turned from this sweet, nice boy into a prick. Hey, no, I liked you before and now you're a douchebag, Romulus. Never change. The injury also caused some language problems for Alexander, as he was now reversing the letters S and SH, both in speech and writing. Those are the Cyrillic letters that make up the S and sh sounds. So it would have sounded like he was speaking with a lisp. The fact that he was still writing with the letters reversed was a bigger problem when it came to school. And there was no shortage of problems at school for Alexander. In addition to this difficulty with the 2 letters, his impulsive behavior made him stand out as well. Standing out because you're exceptional at something could be great in school. Maybe not. Sounds like a great way to get bullied. But standing out because you're constantly misbehaving and can't spell simple words correctly is not. Yeah, Kevin, unless you want to be one of the cool kids, then it's awesome. Alexander's classmates would torment him, bullying him endlessly and referring to him as that retard. It was the 1970s after all. Alexander's mother transferred it. I'm sure they referred to it with the Russian equivalent. I want to know what that is now. Although they're in Cyrillic, so I couldn't read it. Hey ho. Alexander's mother transferred him to a school for children with disabilities, hoping that his ability to socialize and develop would improve once he was away from all the bullies. I mean, this seems to make sense. He does clearly have some sort of neurological injury. He attended a boarding school specializing in speech therapy, though I'm unclear if that was the initial school his mother sent him to or if she transferred him a second time. Regardless, it didn't help. No matter where he went, Alexander felt like an outsider, and his socializing skills didn't really improve. However, as he approached adolescence, his grandfather decided that it was time for a change. He'd always believed Alexander was highly intelligent, and he thought that the boy's talents were being wasted. Sounds like a very nice, supportive grandfather right there. The special schools Alexander attended were focused on overcoming disability rather than on actual school stuff, so his grandfather felt that he wasn't really being given an opportunity to excel. Maybe he'll get expelled. Instead, Alexander's grandfather pulled him out of the boarding school and moved him into his own home. He was put back into the mainstream public school system, and his grandfather encouraged him to try sports and pursue some intellectual pursuits outside of school. Alexander never got into sports, but he did enjoy working out. His grandfather is like, yeah, I enjoy working out. Sports, though, not for me. I don't do any sports, but I work out quite a lot these days. I mean, I didn't. And then I was like, got old, and I was like, I should probably be a bit stronger rather than just have my weak, withery body gradually fade away as I sail through middle age closer to the grave. His grandfather installed a horizontal bar so that Alexander could use it for pull-ups. This was theoretically great for Alexander, as he believed getting visibly swole would prevent the other kids from bullying him. More importantly, however, his grandfather taught him how to play chess. I mean, yeah, if you're a bit of a beast, people are not going to be like, oh, they're going to be like, better not fuck with that guy. He's crazy and huge. And he was a natural. Within days, Alexander was winning almost every game the two played together. His grandfather was thrilled, so he took Alexander down to Bitsevsky Park, better known as Bitzer Park, to play chess. In case anyone is unfamiliar, this is an extremely common thing. Chess is frequently played in parks, and in New York City alone, you can find people playing in Washington Square Park, Central Park, and Union Square Park on a pretty daily basis. People probably less so in the winter. There are always people of all ages and skill levels playing, but one of the biggest draws of these locations is the chess hustlers. I don't know what a chess hustler is. At least back in the day when this story was happening, the parks were full of hustlers. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of extremely strong players hanging out in these parks, and sometimes well-known international masters and grandmasters will go there as well. I just mean that the master-level players who hang out in the park are no longer trying to hustle people and swindle them out of money. Oh wait, so they'll just pretend to be bad at chess, make a bet with someone, and then absolutely demolish them? This seems like the worst hustle, because it's just so mean. And I guess like the hustlers aren't thinking about whether it's mean or not. But I always think of the hustling scene. You guys watch that Fresh Prince of Bel-Air? And I think Will Smith's character, I think also called Will Smith, like goes to a billiard hall or whatever and loses a bunch of money to some guys. And then Uncle Phil's like, don't worry, I'll get this all back. And he goes to the billiard hall and he's at billiards. Like, he's absolutely terrible. And this guy who hustled Will Smith is just also taking like rich old Uncle Phil for a ride. And then Uncle Phil's like, oh, I don't know what to do. Let's just make it, $200 a pocket or whatever. And then the guy's like, all right, old man, if you want to. And then Uncle Phil just turns to his butler, who is called Jeffrey, maybe? And he's like, Jeffrey, break out Lucille. And Lucille is his custom billiard cue. And he's like, let's get to it.
You got yourself a game.
Jeffrey?
Break out, Lucille.
Just demolishes the hustler. Jeffrey, break out Lucille. I hope it was called Lucille. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. Or the name of the butler. These days, you just pay up front to play a game against them and maybe receive friendly advice along the way, rather than it being gambling where they let you think you have a chance at winning. You don't. If you're just a guy, even if you're good at chess, even if you're real good at chess, and you go to play a grandmaster in the park, they're going to demolish you. They're a grandmaster. Going back to Bitzer Park, though, this place is enormous. The entire park is 18 square kilometers or nearly 4,500 acres. God damn, this isn't a city? By comparison, Central Park in New York is a mere 840. And this place is 4,500. Meaning Bitzer Park is over 5 times as large. Also, for people who not familiar with New York, I was genuinely surprised by how absolutely effing massive Central Park is. I'm like, how big can a park in a city be? It's like, oh, absolutely huge. Of course, a lot of the park isn't really used for anything. There are large sections of the park that are heavily wooded and isolated, areas where there aren't even walking trails through them. That's probably not important though, so let's move on. Wait, is that going to become important? I get the feeling he's going to hide some bodies in there or something. He's going to do his murdering in this park, isn't he? But in the section of the park where people were playing chess, Alexander finally felt like he belonged somewhere for the first time in his life. He had always felt like an outsider, but the old men playing chess in the park absolutely loved him. Their affection for him only increased once he started whooping all of their asses in chess. They saw him as their own little chess prodigy, and even though he was still being bullied at school, he wasn't swole yet. They made sure he knew that he would always have a place to play in the park with them. Not only did chess give Alexander something to be proud of in a community of people that made him feel like he belonged, but it was also an outlet to release his aggression. He's just screaming, "F*** your knight!" He's just like ripping it up.
Hey. I'm an uptight buster. You old horny slut!
Fuck your knight, bitch. Not through physical violence, but by domination in chess. Sure, his opponents would spend the entire day chugging vodka in the park while they played, but even drunk, they were probably still better than you or I am at chess. Yeah, I believe it. Unfortunately for Alexander, things began taking a turn when he was 14. His grandfather started dating a woman, Silver Fox, and he spent most of his time with her. To be fair, that makes sense. I can't find his grandfather's exact age anywhere, but if Alexander was 14, then his grandfather was probably at least 54, likely closer to 64. At that age, if he suddenly had the opportunity to get laid on a regular basis, it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't immediately seize the chance. But this situation filled Alexander with resentment. He felt like his grandfather was abandoning him, just like his father had, and he became bitter against the world and people in general. Bit of an overreaction there, mate. He's just got a girlfriend. That old Silver Fox. His grandfather's romantic endeavors weren't going to last, though. Not because he and the woman broke up, but because he suddenly died. Oh, well, that's sad. His grandfather seemed like a genuinely good person. The first murder. Alexander had to go back to live with his mother, and he enrolled in a local vocational school to study carpentry. He also began drinking vodka to numb the loss of his grandfather, who was also his best friend. Yeah, I mean, he's also Russian, so the vodka drinking's got to begin at some point, right? The old men in the park were always drinking while they played chess, so now he'd join them in getting faced. The only difference was that it didn't seem to hinder his gameplay at all. That's what he claimed anyway, but this might have been one of those I drive better when I'm drunk situations. Oh, that's so psycho to say.
Oh, what are you, a cop now? Come on, you know I drive great when I'm drunk.
During this time period, Alexander also began adjusting to his new school. In a manner of speaking, he'd spent the last few years doing pretty much nothing except playing chess and doing pull-ups, and the effects of the latter were now extremely visible. He's going to be ripped. I don't know exactly how old he was in these pictures. Oh, we're going to see some pictures. Oh yeah, okay. He's a big boy. I would not want to get into a scuff with this dude. Here are some younger photos of Alexander to give you an idea of how strong he had become. I'm sure I'll mention it multiple times going forward, so I figured you'd appreciate if I give you a frame of reference rather than just having you guess. Yes. So you'll see it on screen now if you're watching, but if you're just listening to this show, he's a big boy. You know, he looks like he could win in a fight. For some reason in a picture, he's just holding a cat. There's two pictures, and in the right-hand one, he's just like, he looks so serious and buff, and then he's just like, and he's got a cat there as well. It's interesting. Girls really seemed to like him, or at least the fact that he looked like he could break them in half, and his mother even recollected finding a note from one of his female classmates, which was romantic in nature. However, she also said that she never remembers him having a girlfriend at any point in his life. Instead, he continued to gravitate to the old men in the park. Slightly weird. How old is he? Like 15, 16? Guessing? Maybe 17 by the look of these photos? I don't know if I'd be definitely more interested in the girls. Hang out with the old men in the park. According to his mother, it was clear that he had daddy issues and was desperate for the love and approval of some sort of father figure, especially after the sudden and unexpected passing of his grandfather. But it wasn't just his new physique that got Alexander attention at school. It was also his money. Okay, wait, how's he making money? Is he gambling in the park or beating people at chess for money? He wasn't rich or anything, and honestly, I'm not sure where he got all his money from in the first place, unless it was from hustling at chess, but he was always happy to offer his classmates loans. He was extremely generous about lending people money, and he only asked for one thing from them in return: a suicide note. Bro, if this is someone, if you ever have a kid who does this, psychiatrist immediately, because this is crazy. He wants the suicide note, so the people think that if they don't pay him back, he'll kill them, and he'll use the suicide note that they wrote to make it look like they killed themselves. Which, I mean, even if he's not going to use it, if he's not going to use it, it's kind of clever, but it's also fucking psychotic. Alexander explained to anyone that borrowed money from him that if they didn't pay it back, he would murder them and then use the note to make it look like a suicide. Yeah, no, we get that. We know what he's up to. Would that plan actually work? Of course not. When his classmates all tipped off the police that they'd found a collection of dozens of these suicide notes from different students, it would be pretty easy to put together what happened. Well, yeah. But it'd also be like, if anyone grasses on me, I'm going to do the suicide note thing on you too. There will be no witnesses. That said, nobody actually wanted to test Alexander on this either. Sure, he wouldn't actually get away with murdering them, but that doesn't mean he wasn't crazy enough to do it. And honestly, that's all he needs. He just needs... It's like, if you just... In situations like this, just... if you need to get your way, and even if you're not willing to go through on the threat, just make people think that you're crazy enough to do it. I remember I was a kid, I must have been like 12 or 13, and there was an older kid, and we were sitting on a minibus going on a school trip somewhere, and me and my other like cocky mate, who must have been like 12, we would just turn around, and as this guy's trying to have a sleep, we'd just like tap him on the shoulder or whatever to wake him up. And he was a few years older than us, but he wasn't a big kid. We weren't particularly scared of him. Like you'd be scared of some of the other big kids who, they'd whoop your ass if you were doing this. And I will never forget this moment because it taught me this lesson. We were doing this and he just comes up to us. He sits down while he gets up from the minibus. He comes around, he sits down next to us and he says, "Boys, if you do that again, I'm going to break your arms." And then he just goes and sits back down. And we're like, fuck me. Never messed with that kid again. And it taught me this valuable lesson. Does it matter that he would not do that? No, we believed he would. However, as concerning as that whole thing may be, during this time period, Alexander developed a much more unsettling hobby, tormenting children. He had spent most of his life being physically and verbally bullied by other children, and now he wanted revenge. Not on the people that actually bullied him, but on any random child he came across. This often occurred in bits of park where he was playing chess. I guess the old men either didn't care, or they thought it was all in good fun, since Alexander usually presented his threats in a joking manner. I'll murder you. I'll murder you, son. I will murder you. I will take out your eyes. Or maybe they were just too drunk to notice. He would also torment children in his apartment building as well, a 5-story apartment complex in southern Moscow. Obviously, this is not appropriate behavior, but it's also not unpredictable. It's well known that the perpetrators of bullying or abuse are often victims of it themselves, creating a never-ending cycle. However, Alexander's actions went beyond just bullying children because of his own unresolved childhood issues. Whenever he was going somewhere that he knew he would come into contact with children, he would bring a video camera with him. He would also then proceed to record himself harassing the children so that he could watch the videos back later and revel in the feelings of godlike power that the assaults gave him. Whatever happened to your brain at that swing has just absolutely ruined your brain. That's crazy. In one of these videos, he held a child from his apartment building over a balcony by one leg. He then looked at the camera and said, "You are in my power now. I am going to drop you, and you will fall 15 meters to your death." Fortunately, he didn't drop the kid, but eventually, these threats weren't going to be enough to sate Alexander's lust for power, and that's when he found a source of inspiration. In 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was convicted of 52 of the 53 murders for which he was tried. He began making headlines as the most prolific serial killer in Russian history, though this isn't completely accurate. There were these two women back in the days of the Russian Empire, Darya Saltykova in the 1700s and Olga Briskin in the 1800s. Both were members of the aristocracy who were known for torturing and murdering serfs on their estates. But this is the problem. We're quite far back in time now, and there's all sorts of biases and stuff like that. Like the Countess Elizabeth Bathory thing, the one, she bathed in the blood of virgins. Extremely unlikely, but people believe it to be true. Both were members of the aristocracy who were known for torturing and murdering their serfs on their estates. Olga had 128 confirmed victims. Yeah, was this confirmed at the time, though? Because then they'll be like, you're possessed by the devil, and we must burn you at the stake, you witch. People were weird in the past. And though Dyer only had 38 confirmed, she's believed to have murdered 147 serfs. Maybe they aren't normally listed because it happened so long ago, or maybe it's because serfs weren't considered people, so those murders didn't count. Yeah, I think because it happened a long time ago and it's going to be real hard to confirm that. Although Kevin says they are confirmed. Hey-ho. Regardless, Chikatilo was big news and he became Alexander's idol. He started dressing like Chikatilo and collecting newspaper clippings about him. It said that he actually never considered murder before this, though I don't know how sure of that we can be since he isn't always the most reliable narrator when it comes to his own motivations. Regardless, Alexander had just turned 18 years old, which meant that it was time for him to decide what he was going to do for the rest of his life. And that decision was to become Russia's most prolific murderer. Dude, that's so fucking weird. But it was more specific than that. He was going to murder 64 people, one for every space on the chessboard. At least that was the original goal. After his arrest, Alexander denied any intention of stopping at 64 murders and said that once the chessboard was full, he was going to start filling all 100 squares on an international checkers board. What? There's an international checkers board? I didn't even realize there was a separate checkers board. People play checkers competitively. Isn't checkers a closed game? Like, is it called a closed game? Like where there's only so many solutions and ways to play it. Like it runs out of options, unlike chess. I didn't even know such a game existed, but it's just checkers played on a 10x10 board instead of an 8x8 one. Maybe that does make a big difference, having those extra spaces, because exponential growth or whatever it's called, like there's more options, something like that. I wish I knew all these maths terms, I don't. Now that Alexander had his plan, there was just one problem. Well, two if you count the fact that his plan was insane, and he should absolutely not go through with it. But to Alexander, the problem was that he'd never murdered anybody before, and he wasn't really sure how to go about it. Intent on breaking every one of the casual criminalist rules of criminals, he decided that perhaps he needed an accomplice to commit the murders with. You know, some people are like, I don't know, I'm a bit afraid of going into business by myself. I think I do need a business partner. This guy's like, I'm a little bit afraid of getting into murder by myself. I think I do need an accomplice. Terrible idea. Alexander went to his friend and classmate, Mikhail Odichuk, and said that he wanted a partner to help him murder a bunch of people. Mikhail's response was essentially, yeah, I am so down to be a serial killer. Really? According to Alexander, they both claimed they wanted to be maniacs, so they began planning how to kill people. They agreed that their weapon of choice would be a hammer. Okay, at this point, I'm kind of thinking Mikhail's probably, he could just be excused for being an edgy teenager. He's like, yeah, we're going to murder. And then when he's, he's like, okay, come around my house tomorrow, we're going to go murder someone. He'd be like, bro, no, this was just a joke. Please don't murder me. Unfortunately for Mikhail, his heart really wasn't in it. He wasn't actually interested in killing people and just had gone along with it for a laugh. But he was now in a bind. He didn't know how to distance himself from the bloodthirsty Alexander, so he half-heartedly kept going along with things, feigning desire to commit murder. Dude, can you imagine he does this until he actually commits murder? Like, alongside this dude, he goes to prison for the rest of his life and his excuses. Like, I don't know, I just went along with it. The decline in interest really pissed Alexander off. He thought he'd found a partner to commit his crimes with, but it was clear to him that Mikhail thought it was all a game. His resentment towards Mikhail continued to grow until he decided that if Mikhail wasn't going to be his accomplice, instead he would be his first victim. I fucking knew it, dude. Over the next 2 months, Alexander plotted Mikhail's death. Not only was it going to be his first murder, but ultimately it would be the only one that involved any long-term planning. Alexander didn't want to get caught, but he knew he was going to be a suspect. Eventually, he decided that as long as a body was never found, it wouldn't be ruled as a crime. No body, no crime. Don't think that's how it works, mate. Initially, he thought about burying Mikhail's body or drowning him in a lake, but he ruled these out. Both options seemed like they would require far too much time and effort, with too high a chance of being noticed. Instead, he came up with a much more elegant solution. Alexander invited Mikhail to Bitzer Park, claiming they were going to search for a spot to lure their first victim. He was searching for a spot to lure his first victim. It was Mikhail. Mikhail agreed, not realizing that he was the first victim being lured to his death. As they ventured off the path into the woods, they arrived at what is alternatively described as either a well or a sewer. Hey, in Soviet Russia, sewer is well. Basically, it was a manhole cover that led to sewers running beneath the entire park, emptying the city's main sewer system. A body that was dumped into one of these sewers would either be lost forever or turn up at one of the city's sewage treatment plants. When this happened, there would be no way to determine where the body had entered the sewers, and the deaths would be written off as either accidents or suicides. How did he commit suicide? Oh, he threw himself into the sewer. What the fuck? Once they arrived at the location, Alexander wrapped a nylon cord around Mikhail's neck and strangled him to death before dumping his body in the sewer and heading home. And he fucking loved it. He equated his first murder to his first love and was thrilled that it had been somebody he knew. His brain is so broken. It really is. Although a number of his eventual victims would be strangers, Alexander much preferred to kill people that he was acquainted with. Dude. Even if it was a complete stranger, he'd talk to the person as much as possible before ending their life. He wanted to know all of their hopes and dreams, reveling in the knowledge that they had all of these plans for the future, a future that they would never see because of him. Having direct knowledge of the life he was robbing his victims of made Alexander feel like a powerful deity. My dude, what is up? Of course, once Mikhail disappeared, police came knocking on Alexander's door. He was the last person anyone had seen Mikhail with, and another classmate undoubtedly revealed to police that Mikhail was among the people who had written one of those suicide notes in exchange for a loan. But Alexander was able to remain completely calm while being interviewed, hiding his sadistic glee over the situation. He admitted to going to Bitzer Park with Mikhail, but he said that he'd left his friend there unharmed. I mean, probably not in those exact words, since that would sound super suspicious, but you know what I mean. They went to the park and everything was fine. Then Alexander walked the 5 minutes back to his apartment. In the end, with no body and no reason to suspect foul play, Mikhail's file was tossed among the countless other missing person cold cases. However, the whole ordeal with being interrogated by the police spooked Alexander. Despite being in very good shape already, he was also concerned that he wouldn't be able to overpower someone stronger than Mikhail. As a result, Alexander didn't kill again for 9 years, spending much of his time working out and getting even stronger. Now, if anybody listening to this is familiar with the case, there's a good chance you may have heard a story that contradicts what I just said. There is a frequently repeated claim that Alexander killed one more person in 1992 and another a few years later before his real spree began. There are even 2 different versions of that story. According to the story, Alexander had a neighbor called Olga, who it is claimed he was in love with. In some versions of the story, she had no interest in him. In others, she had been his girlfriend but dumped him. Either way, she began dating another boy named Sergei. We've got like all of the classic Russian names: Olga, Sergei, Mikhail. Where's Vlad? It's said that Alexander went to Sergei's apartment to confirm where's Boris, to confront him, and threw him out of a window. Although Alexander was interviewed as a possible lead in the case, it was ruled a suicide by police. They found a note. 5 years later, Olga was found dead in Bitzer Park, and it's believed by some that she was one of Alexander's victims. I mean, yeah, if you're like close to a serial killer and you shot mysteriously dead, it does seem quite likely that that serial killer you live next door to murdered you. I mean, more likely than not, no? I figured it was worth addressing since I've seen this story so many times, and maybe people are familiar with it, but I am 99% sure that it never happened, especially because there are no last names for the supposed victims, and the story didn't appear in a single Russian source that I found. There was indeed a woman named Olga who Alexander fell in love with, a victim named Sergei whose girlfriend Alexander met, and a defenestration, but those are 3 unrelated stories that will come later. I'm pretty sure this was a case of one person publishing a story with some of the details mixed up, possibly from faulty translations, and then it getting repeated in countless other articles because internet. Yes, all the time. The 9-year lull. After graduating high school, there was an obvious next course of action for Alexander. Fill the chessboard with botched. He had been studying to become a carpenter, but there was a much more appealing career opportunity. He was in excellent physical shape, his skill on the chessboard showed a brilliant tactical mind, and he really just wanted to kill people. Sounds like he's a perfect fit for chess boxing. What would possibly be a better fit than joining the army?
These are my words, Mother. From Army. The seal is for marksmanship, and the gorilla is for sand racing.
I mean, yeah, okay, I see why. Unfortunately for Alexander, the army disagreed. I don't know what the hell he said during his interview when trying to enlist, but it must have been pretty concerning. I feel like when you interview for the army, they're going to be looking out for psychos, right? Because they don't want people just going rogue and murdering people on the battlefield or willy-nilly, right? He failed his psych eval, there we go, and was given a referral for a psychiatric facility to treat what they perceived as serious mental health problems. Well, that's very astute of them, because he clearly does have severe mental health problems. Alexander didn't take them up on this offer, instead coping with the rejection by becoming a severe alcoholic. He had already been drinking lots of vodka at this point, but it had got really bad. Alexander would get so shit-faced that when he returned home to the apartment building, he would have to wait for his mother to get home to help him up the stairs. God damn, that is drunk. Aside from the old men in the park with whom he played chess, he had no friends. The only things that he really cared about were his pet cat and dog. While serial killers often start by torturing and killing animals, Alexander was an animal lover. It was one of the few things his neighbors knew about him. A neighbor even recalled finding Alexander drunk and sobbing in the stairwell of the apartment building because an animal had died and he wasn't able to help it. It wasn't even one of his own pets. But with his dreams of joining the military over, Alexander did need to get a job. Rather than going into carpentry as he'd trained for at the vocational school, he got a job stocking shelves at the local grocery store. This would be the same job he held until he was finally arrested. And really, that's pretty much what happened for the next 9 years. Alexander was either at work, drunk, playing chess, or some combination of all of those things. And even though people generally regarded him as friendly, and he is usually described as well-liked, he was mostly just floating through life. I wish he continued floating through life rather than decided to become Russia's most prolific serial killer. It would be much better if he just floated on through, doing the grocery store, earning some money, drinking some vodka, playing some chess, living out his Russian dream. And I say he's usually described as well-liked, but apparently he also had a rather disturbing tendency of spending his free time at work hanging out in the back room and mercilessly stabbing boxers with his box cutter. Even if his neighbors and random acquaintances thought he was nice, his co-workers who witnessed this behavior thought he was a weird, creepy guy they wanted nothing to do with, and understandably so. He must have been really going at those boxes. Because if I went, I don't know, I used to work in a supermarket, if I went back and saw it was like smashing up boxes, like, you know, there's a huge pile of them and they're, I don't know, maybe not with a box cutter, but like stamping on them, I'd be like, can I join in? And we'd stamp on boxes together, it'd be fun. But he must have been doing it real psycho. Because I think if I just came in the back and there's just some dude just stabbing the out of a box, I'd be like, oh. Then tragedy struck. I'm not sure whether this happened in 2001 or if it was earlier, but Alexander's beloved pet dog died. He buried the dog in Bitzer Park at a location to which he would frequently return. The sewer years. On May 17th, 2001, Alexander would claim his second victim, a 52-year-old man named Yevgeny Pronin. The two were actually well acquainted, as Yevgeny was one of the older men with whom Alexander would play chess in the park. After their game, he said that it was the anniversary of his dog's death, and he asked if Yevgeny would come to the grave to share a toast with him in honor of his dog. The park was considered a safe place until Alexander rose to infamy, so there was no reason to be suspicious of walking into the woods. Plus, Yevgeny was never one to turn down a free drink. His nickname was Kaif, which was a term in Russia used to describe a drug-induced euphoria. Basically, he was so perpetually intoxicated that his name was just Stoned. Can imagine, that's a good name for someone who's just, you know, constantly on it. They walked into the woods, presumably to where Alexander had buried his dog. They shared some vodka while toasting to the memory of the beloved pet. Then, Alexander swung the vodka bottle against the back of Yevgeny's head, incapacitating the man. He then tossed the body into the sewers, where Yevgeny died by drowning in sewage, which is why no one would kill themselves. No one commits suicide in the sewers. It's fucking disgusting down there. Alexander then went home to begin tallying his victims. Bro, you don't need to tally them. The number's 2. Can you not remember that? They're people you've killed. It's 2. Before using his chessboard, he originally used the 15 squares, which is either a nickname for one of those sliding puzzles with 15 tiles, or it's just an awkward translation. Either way, he glued the numbers 1 and 2 onto the tiles to represent Mikhail and Yevgeny's murders, using numbers that were cut either out of magazines or newspapers. This continued until all 15 tiles were filled, at which point Alexander switched to his chessboard. He began filling the chessboard squares by gluing checkers to the board. Once he ran out of checkers, he used bottle caps from beer and vodka bottles. This was eventually replaced with the board using numbers as the original sliding puzzle had. It didn't take long for Alexander to exhaust the tiles on the sliding puzzle. Jesus Christ, 15 people? As his third murder took place just 6 days after the murder of Yevgeny. This time, his victim was a 64-year-old man called Vyacheslav Klimov. He met Klimov at a nearby metro station, and the two began talking and drinking together. For the most part, all of the early murders were extremely similar. Alexander would target old men and lure them to the woods in Bitzer Park to toast the anniversary of his dog's death. The men he targeted were generally either homeless or loners, and they were almost always alcoholics. It was easy to lure people into the park with the promise of free cigarettes and vodka, and once there, Alexander would toss them into the sewers to drown. A month after Klimov's murder, Alexander tried again, though this time, things didn't go quite so smoothly. He met a roughly 60-year-old man who he referred to as Yuri, though the body was never properly identified, so his full name and age are unknown. Yuri was outside a nearby sporting goods store, and Alexander lured him into the woods, as he had done with others. When he tossed Yuri into the well, however, Yuri caught himself on a piece of metal on the way down. Alexander had to lower himself past the manhole cover and hit Yuri's hands until he finally let go and fell to his death. Oh my god, this is grim, dude. 4 days later, Alexander struck again. This time, how does he go 9 years without killing anyone? And then it's just like, and it begins. Because his brain is ruined. That swing ruined his brain. This would suck if this happens to you. Like, I can imagine I'm just swinging on my swing at home, it smashes me in the head, and now I'm a psycho. and I just want to kill. You'd be like, it's not me, I don't know what happened. 4 days later, he struck again, targeting 65-year-old Nikolai Tikhomarov. 3 days later, 73-year-old Nikolai Filipov went out to buy cigarettes and never returned. Another 3 days later, it was 49-year-old Oleg Lyov. Oleg and Alexander had actually known each other for about 5 years and had stayed in touch pretty much the entire time. I believe it was one of his chess friends from Bitzer Park. However, when they ran into each other that day in July, Oleg revealed that he had been homeless for about 2 weeks at that point. Thanks to this new revelation, Alexander decided that he would be his next victim and invited Oleg to come and toast his dog in the woods. Of all the people he killed, Oleg was the only one that Alexander admitted to ever feeling any guilt or remorse over. It must have weighed heavy on his soul, because after taking another victim every 3 or 4 days for almost 2 weeks, Alexander instead took a break for 11 days. Then on July the 13th, he met Gennady Safanov, a 61-year-old man who had escaped from a local rehab facility. The next day, Alexander ran into an acquaintance, 44-year-old Sergei Pavlov. Alexander invited Sergei to come and drink with him in the woods, which was weird since he was walking home with his girlfriend at the time. At first, Sergei refused, but eventually he sent his girlfriend home ahead of him and went to the woods to drink with Alexander. That's so weird. Just can't imagine walking home with my wife from dinner and they, oh, hey mate, how you doing? And they're like, you want to go to the park and drink vodka? And we're like, wait, like both of us? No, mate, just you. My wife would be like, what the fuck? No. Walk me home, what the fuck? Sergei was the youngest victim since Mikhail, and he was also the first person to fight back. Unfortunately, Alexander was able to overpower him and toss him into the sewers. A week later, Alexander did the same thing to 45-year-old Viktor Yelostratov and 54-year-old Viktor Volkov on consecutive days. That was 10 victims in 2 months, all of whom disappeared in the same place. It's the sort of thing you'd expect would get a lot of press, right? Yes, obviously. Surely the police would be insanely all over this. Well, sadly, no. Nikolai Tikhomarov's body was discovered at a sewage treatment plant the day after he was murdered. When his stepson was informed that Nikolai had been found dead there, his response was essentially, yeah, sounds about right. Nikolai was a severe alcoholic who was frequently too drunk to walk without falling over, so the idea that he would have accidentally fallen into a sewer and drowned just seemed to make sense. I mean, yeah, these are the people who they don't get the attention because they're homeless and they're vagrants, they're alcoholics. The police be like, oh, they just fell in a sewer, yeah. I don't want that description to come across as being disrespectful to the victims, but the stepson's reaction was exactly why these were the people Alexander was targeting. Yes, exactly. He wanted to murder people that either didn't have anyone who would notice they were gone, or who could plausibly disappear without warning and or accidentally wind up dead in a sewer. Yeah, but when suddenly loads of them are, it's very suspicious. This is all happening over the course of like a month, 2 months, 2 weeks, then 11-day break, and then back to it. That's not to say that there wasn't anybody concerned about the other disappearances, though. Some of them were reported missing, but those reports weren't given a lot of attention. The sewers in which Alexander disposed of his victims were near the southern portion of Bitzer Park, bordering on the Yuzhnoye Butovo district of Moscow. This area was known to locals as Zhopa Mira, essentially the arsehole of the world. Brilliant. That nickname was used to describe various places throughout Russia that were poor and underdeveloped, but for those in Moscow, it almost always meant this district. In the 1990s and early 2000s anyway. It's actually a lot nicer now. Yeah, gentrification. But as it turns out, some people don't want to live in the world's arsehole. They wanted a better life. As such, people disappearing was a pretty common thing. They would try and move somewhere in search of better opportunities, but more often than not, they'd always just return. Given how frequently this all happened, police didn't take a handful of disappearances seriously. After all, it's not like they knew that all of these men had disappeared in the same place after last being seen with the same person. No, they were thrown in the sewers and washed out to the sewage treatment plants. I mean, it's a good way to dispose of a body, I gotta say. It's working out for him. As far as the police were concerned, these men were probably just trying to escape their shitty lives and would be back within a couple of weeks. If they never came back, then either they succeeded and decided to start a new life without their existing family, or they were roaming the streets of Moscow as drunken transients. Either way, the police felt it wasn't their problem. 10 murders, 2 months, and the police had no idea there had been a single murder, let alone there was a maniacal serial killer on the loose. On July the 26th, 5 days after his previous murder, Alexander would try again, but this time, he made a mistake that nearly resulted in him getting caught. His victim was 22-year-old Andrei Konovaltsev, better known to his friends as the Terminator. Unfortunately, despite the badass nickname, this encounter didn't end the way that we all would have wanted. Yeah, with his death. I mean, the Alexander's death. not Konovaltsev's. Alexander was able to overpower Andrei and toss him into the sewers, but one blow to the back of his head with the vodka bottle had been enough to take him down. Andrei was able to resist and call for help, but by the time anyone arrived, both Andrei and Alexander were gone. And I guess they either didn't notice the manhole cover, or it didn't occur to them that someone could have been thrown down there. Still, it was too close of a call, and Alexander decided to lay low for the next 6 months, but he wasn't able to resist his urges. His brain is so broken. He managed to resist his urges for, 9 years? And now he can't. Come on. As he later explained, he killed so many people. For me, life without murder is like life without food for you. He needed to kill again, but he didn't want to get caught, so he decided to try something different. On January 18th, 2002, Alexander ran into 39-year-old homeless man who was only known as Václav. He convinced the man to come join him for a party in the stairwell of a nearby 16-story building. Ah yes, the stairwell parties of a 16-story building, well known. The two drank in the stairwell together for a bit, then Alexander threw the man off the 16th story of the building. Jesus Christ. The death was ruled an accident, so Alexander was able to avoid suspicion, but he wasn't satisfied. Murder usually gave him sexual gratification, as well as a godlike feeling, but this method didn't do anything for him. So it was back to his tried and true method of murder in Bitzer Park, as he already knew that would give him the pleasure he sought. 11 days later, he murdered 42-year-old Andrei Veselovsky. 2 weeks later, his victim was 47-year-old Yuri Chomakov. These murders played out exactly as all the others had, and again, his victims were both known alcoholics whose disappearances didn't draw any attention. But 2 weeks later, on February 23rd, he had changed things up a bit. Rather than targeting predominantly older men, he was ready to take his first female victim, 19-year-old Maria Vuricheva, who was 5 months pregnant with a baby girl. She had a stand selling cosmetics near the metro station, where Alexander would frequently search for drunken victims, and the two had been casually acquainted for about a year. That night, Maria was crying because she had a fight with her boyfriend, so Alexander made her an offer to help cheer her up. Now, there are two different stories of what he offered to lure her to the park. In one version, he offered to pay her to help him carry some heavy bags home. Because pregnant women are known for carrying heavy things for people and not the other way around. According to the other version of the story, he offered to give her some boxes of cameras that he'd stolen from a factory and hidden in the woods. He told her that she could make a lot of money pushing the stolen cameras at her stand, and that he would let her keep most of the profits. Regardless of which method he used, he was able to lure Maria into the woods and toss her into the sewer. The latter one sounds like a lot more likely. Maria managed to catch herself as she was falling by grabbing onto the sides of the opening to the sewers, so Alexander grabbed her by the hair and smashed her head into the stone walls of the well until she let go and fell into the sewer. This is a 5-month pregnant woman. Unlike most of the other victims, however, Maria survived the fall. She was initially in shock after plunging into the icy waters below, but she managed to regain her composure as the current began carrying her away. She found a fixture she could grab onto to keep from getting swept away, and she knew that to be a hatch through which she could escape. Please tell me, now we're through her eyes. We would only know this because she told it, right? So she survives? I like that. But it was nighttime, so there was no way for her to see. All she could do was hold on and stand waist deep in the frigid waters until dawn broke, hoping she would see sunlight sneaking into the sewers from a hatch through which she could escape. As it turned out, the hatch had been right next to her the entire time. Maria used the last of her strength to open the hatch and crawl out before collapsing on the ground and calling for help. Some passers-by heard her and immediately called an ambulance and the police. This has gotta be, he's gonna be identified and caught, surely. But we're not near the end of the episode. She was taken to hospital to treat her still bleeding head wounds and was interviewed by the police. Good. Maria explained that this man had tried to murder her in Bitzer Park and that she could definitely identify him. The police's response to her was something that many of you, I've heard Simon say numerous times before. Papers, please. Yeah, because I did a gaming stream on one of my other channels where he played this fantastic, I think it's an indie game, Papers, Please. It's a good time. When the Soviet Union fell a decade earlier, jobs in Russia were difficult to find. Many people, including Maria, illegally moved to Moscow for work without proper registration papers. Please don't tell me that this is what stops the police catching someone who's murdered dozens of people. The police decided they'd let her crime slide so long as she dropped this whole attempted murder thing and didn't go ahead with filing charges. What is the motivation? Now, obviously, that's fucked, and I'm not going to defend the police here. I can't even imagine the reason. I do think I can at least explain why this might have happened, though. Okay, Kevster. I mean, to start, there was a lot of police corruption, but when authorities finally acknowledged there was a serial killer on the loose, the head of the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department was Andrei Superneko. The reason Andrei was able to be promoted to this position was because his predecessor was murdered by organized criminals in Moscow. Jesus. Okay, but what's this Alexander guy got? He's not connected to the mob. That's still no excuse for what happens, and if you're too scared of criminals to do your job, then don't become a police officer. But given that the Russian mafia apparently had no problem murdering cops, I can at least sort of understand why they may not want to risk their lives over a mere attempted murder. Yeah, but what makes you think it's connected to the mob? Should be like, this has nothing to do with the mob, it's one lone psycho. Just go do your fucking jobs. Can you imagine being so... I hope her baby's okay. Can you imagine being so desperately let down by the system? Or maybe they were just fucking lazy. Either way, sounds like whoever interviewed Maria really shouldn't have been a cop in the first place. No, it sounds like, honestly, they belong in prison. This kind of fucking negligence. In the interest of fairness, though, I will mention that one Russian source, most of which are silent on the matter, specified that it was Maria who chose not to involve the police at all, with her instead claiming she fell into the sewers by accident to avoid drawing attention to herself and the fact that she was in Moscow illegally. It's possible this was just revisionist history by the Russian press to keep the police from looking bad, but both versions of the story agree that a lack of registration papers was the reason an investigation into her attempted murder never went anywhere. But the police know there's been bodies showing up in the sewers, and she was thrown into the sewer. Like, what are you doing, police? This is fucking shameful. On the bright side, though, none of this had any effect on Maria's pregnancy, and she gave birth to a healthy baby girl a few months later. Excellent. Of course, Alexander had no idea any of that had happened. As far as he knew, Maria's murder... Can you imagine this guy who tried to kill her is just out there free, and she's like, what the fuck, guys? As far as he knew, Maria's murder had been just as successful as the others. So 4 days later, he took another female victim, Vera Sakharova. A week later, his victim was 47-year-old Boris Nesterov. I knew there'd be a Boris at some point. Alexander had already had problems with his younger victims fighting back, but this time he was shocked when Boris did something he hadn't even considered. The two drank in the woods for a bit, then Boris just started walking away back to the park entrance before Alexander even had a chance to attack him. For a minute there, I thought it was like, and Boris attacked him. And they're like, wait, you? And then Boris points and they're like, you? And they're like, killer. And then they shake hands and go on their own ways. Alexander chased after Boris, who turned around and quickly punched him in the throat. It wasn't enough to dissuade him, though, and he was able to knock Boris down, kicking him in the head until he stopped resisting. He then dragged Boris's body back to the sewer and dropped it inside. With this murder not having gone quite as expected, Alexander again punched in the throat. That's not a good time. Alexander decided to choose an easier target for the very next day. Alexei Fedorov was a 42-year-old man living with his mother and sister in the same building where Alexander lived. Alexei was another heavy drinker and was also disabled. This murder went according to the usual plan, with the only difficulty being that Alexei was so overweight it took Alexander about 20 minutes to force his body into the sewer. Jesus Christ. So not only, what a fucking coward, he gets punched in the throat one time and he's like, oh yeah, I better only murder disabled people now. Fucking psycho piece of shit. 2 days later, Alexander chose 13-year-old. Wow, just when I thought he couldn't be more of a piece of shit. Here we go. Mikhail Lobov as his new victim. Mikhail was an orphan who had run away from the orphanage. He would hang out with other young punks drinking vodka near the metro station where Alexander found his other victims. Alexander enticed him to the woods by offering him money to help him move some heavy appliances. They drank as they walked. Then Alexander hit him in the back of the head with the vodka bottle and tossed him into the sewer like all the others. But just like Maria, Mikhail survived the fall. His jacket got snagged on something, preventing him from being swept away, and he climbed his way back out of the sewers. Once again, Mikhail went to the police, fully able to identify Alexander, and once again the police were not interested. Even though Mikhail had just survived an attempted murder, all the police saw was a punk who reeked of vodka and sewer water who was trying to play a prank on them. Oh my god, police, you think he just, dumped himself in sewer water for fun, just to mess with you? You are fucking incompetent and lazy pieces of shit. A few days later, Mikhail and Alexander saw one another at a metro station. Mikhail understandably freaked the fuck out and tried to alert a nearby police officer, but again the police weren't interested in what they saw as the lunatic ravings of a punk teenager. Once again though, Alexander was spooked and decided to lay low for a bit. It would be over 5 months before he killed again. More importantly, he decided he had to change things up. He still didn't know that Maria survived, but he had seen Mikhail alive and well after he thought the boy was dead. That couldn't happen again. So from now on, he wasn't going to throw anybody into the sewers until he was sure they were dead. His next murder would be completely different, though. On August the 24th, he chose 43-year-old German Chereyakov as his next victim. Oh, okay, so I thought he was a German guy for a second, but his name is German. German was a violinist by trade, but had recently lost his job and his home. However, there was a cabin where he was staying for the summer. It's unclear whether he owned the cabin, was being allowed to stay there by someone else, or was squatting. It's not really important. Alexander had acquired a new weapon, and the cabin gave him somewhere isolated to test it out. The weapon was a pen gun. I kind of thought these were fiction, or at least impractical devices that only really existed in spy movies, but apparently they're very real and widely available for sale. Wow. Well, not in Russia. Alexander had to get his illegally, but if you're an American, you could just buy them, because who wouldn't want to keep a gun clipped in their breast pocket so that it misfires and shoots directly into your heart? Does seem a little bit risky, doesn't it? Anyway, Alexander snuck into the cabin in the early morning hours and fired his pen gun at German. He missed, so he fired again, and the second bullet killed German instantly. Wow, these little pen guns so powerful? Alexander then went home and left the body in the cabin, though this wouldn't be tied to the other murders until he confessed to it because of how different it was. He used the pen gun to take 2 more victims in September, Nikolai Ilinsky and Vyacheslav Minaev. His next attempt on September the 30th didn't go as well, though. His new victim was 42-year-old Sergei Fedorov. Sergei, also known as Hedgehog, for reasons I haven't been able to deduce, was a homeless man living in Bitzer Park. Alexander, again, lured him to the sewer with free booze and attempted to shoot him behind with the pen gun. Alexander fired twice, hitting Sergei in the head both times, but Sergei didn't die. Alexander then injured himself while trying to reload, so he just grabbed the crowbar he used to pry open the manhole cover and hit Sergei in the head with it. He threw Sergei's body into the sewer, then tossed the pen gun in as well, deciding it was a useless weapon. Instead, he was going to rely on something much more simple. He was going to use the weapon that Mikhail had agreed upon all those years ago. A hammer. His method still remains largely the same, luring people into the woods to toast the anniversary of his dead dog, but now instead of just tossing him in the sewers, Alexander would bash their skulls in with a hammer first. He would always attack from behind, both for the element of surprise and because he thought it would prevent blood from getting on his clothes. The repeated strikes from the hammer would often leave a hole in the back of the victim's head, and Alexander would occasionally shove a stick or the neck of a vodka bottle into the hole before disposing of the body. Over the next year, Alexander would kill 12 more people this way. Because he was making sure the victims were dead before leaving the bodies and using a reliable weapon, these murders largely went without incident. 2 days after killing Sergei, Alexander took his first victim using this new method. The man was 46-year-old Alexei Pushov, a disabled friend of Alexander's, because every time things went wrong with his method of killing people, he apparently liked to test his new method out on a disabled person, because he's a psycho. 10 days later, Alexander took the life of Valery Dolbatov. After Valerie's murder, there was a brief pause for a few months. Unlike the previous pauses, this one was not preceded by a close call, so we're not sure why Alexander chose to take a hiatus. Things started up again on March 13th, 2003, with the murder of 73-year-old Liang Fatkulin. 2 weeks later, Alexander murdered 42-year-old Viktor Ilin, and a week later, it was 62-year-old Igor Kashtanov with 42-year-old Oleg Boyrov 2 days later. A month later, Alexander killed his co-worker from the grocery store, 40-year-old Vasily Stanovoy. 2 days later, he murdered 45-year-old Sergei Chudin. There was another break of just over 3 months before he killed a man identified only as Vladimir. 3 days after that, Alexander struck again, murdering 42-year-old Yegor Kudrysev. Wow, he really hates 40-year-olds, doesn't he? People in their 40s he's really not a fan of. And just so we're clear, no, the police still had no idea there was a serial killer on the loose. The only bodies that had been found were at sewage treatment plants, and they were all ruled to have been accidental deaths. Wait, there was one dude who was shot in the head twice. Whoops! When Yegor was reported missing, he was presumed by the police to either be in prison or a psychiatric hospital. Well, that definitely sounds like something you could check, the police, come on. So they didn't even search for him. It would have been really easy for them to verify their hunch by looking to see if Yegor had been admitted to either, but they didn't even do that. Oh my god, just assume if you're in Russia, which you're probably not, I don't think YouTube works in Russia anymore, that if a crime happens to you, nothing's going to happen. The police are going to do nothing. On October the 14th, Alexander murdered 43-year-old Vladimir Fomin, another co-worker of his. A month later, 43-year-old Vladimir Fedosov became Alexander's 34th murder victim, all but one of which had taken place in the span of just 2.5 years. Alexander's final attack of 2003 took place on November 15th, the day right after his previous murder. This time, the victim was his 31-year-old friend and neighbor, Nikolai Polikarpov. As usual, Alexander plied his victim with vodka before hitting him multiple times in the head with a hammer and tossing the corpse into the sewer. But while Nikolai looked unconscious, he survived the blows to his head. After being thrown in the sewer, his jacket got caught, preventing him from getting taken away by the currents. Fortunately, he was also caught in such a way that his head was above water, preventing him from drowning. After regaining consciousness, Nikolai managed to climb his way out of the sewer and return home. Jesus Christ. Watch for infection, mate. You've got a head wound and you're in a sewer. A few days later, Alexander happened to see Nikolai outside of the apartment building, so he walked up and asked how he was doing. As it turned out, Nikolai had absolutely no memory of what had happened thanks to his traumatic head injury. Oh no, what is it? Come on! How does this guy keep Although, even if he had perfect memory, he'd go to the police and they'd be like, no. Get out of here. You don't have murder. You're not murder. You fell on hammer. It was a close call, and everything could have ended right there for the third time, but once again, luck was for some reason on Alexander's side. This was by far his closest call yet. The victim who survived wasn't just someone that could pick Alexander out of a lineup, it was someone who knew his name, where he lived, where he worked and hung out, and it was once again time to lay low, so he put his murderous ways on hiatus for the next year and a half. Alexander didn't strike again until June 2005, when he killed his 40-year-old friend, Andrei Maslov. He's killing all his friends, isn't this? I mean, I'm just like, aren't the police noticing that all of his friends are dying? Like, he's the common connection. And then you got to remember, the police don't care. But this was the last time he'd dump a body in the sewers. He had murdered 36 people now, but nobody knew. As far as everybody knew, there was a bunch of missing persons cases, but that wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It didn't even occur to anyone that one of Russia's worst killers was active in their neighborhood. For Alexander, that wouldn't do at all. He wanted to be the very best, like no one ever was. To kill them was his real test, but recognition was his cause. It had all started with an obsession with Chikatilo and the media circus surrounding his trial and conviction. All along, he'd wanted to claim more victims than Chikatilo did, but would it even count if nobody even knew he was doing it? From that day forward, Alexander decided that he would leave the bodies out in the open and make sure that people knew there was a serial killer on the loose. The Bitzer Park Maniac. Rumors of the Bitzer Park Maniac had existed since the 1980s, but nobody ever took it seriously. It was an urban legend meant to scare children, and there was no evidence for claiming such a person existed. The park was considered a safe place and one of the prides of Moscow. That all changed in 2005 after Alexander decided to stop hiding the bodies of his victims. He took a few months after the previous murder to compose himself and prepare for going public. But on September 28th, he was ready. His victim was 46-year-old Yuri Kuznetsov. The plan was to murder Yuri with his hammer, but things didn't go down as expected. After drinking a bottle of vodka, Yuri passed out, and Alexander decided to refrain from his normal modus operandi. Instead, he filled Yuri's mouth with vodka, covered his mouth and nose, shook his head to force the vodka down his throat and into his lungs, drowning him. The body was discovered by some people walking through the park the next day, but the police assumed he'd died of alcohol poisoning. How about you send him for an autopsy? How about you do your f***ing job, police? You lazy fucks. A month later, Alexander tried again. This time, his victim was a 31-year-old homeless man named Nikolai Vorobyov. Alexander began with his usual routine, luring his victim to the woods, hitting him in the back of the head with a hammer. The blow wasn't fatal, and instead of playing dead and hoping Alexander would leave him there, Nikolai immediately got up and bolted as fast as he could. Alexander gave chase, but despite the head injury, Nikolai was fast. They raced through the woods, and before long, Nikolai was just a few meters from escaping the woods and reaching the busy street running alongside Bitzer Park. That's when Alexander finally caught up and finished what he'd begun. When Nikolai's body was found, police finally had to admit that something was going on in Bitzer Park. There had been a disproportionately high number of missing persons cases originating from the park and surrounding area, but that had just been chalked up to variance. It wasn't until the next body was found, however, that the police understood that they had a serial killer on their hands. Alexander's next victim was 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko, a former police sergeant. Alexander killed Nikolai with a hammer, as he had killed so many before, shattering his skull and then inserting the neck of the vodka bottle into the hole he created, something he would do with all his subsequent victims to ensure people knew there was a serial killer and how many lives he'd personally taken based on how many bodies were found in the Bitzer Park woods with these vodka bottles in their heads. Of course, not all of the bodies of Alexander's victims were found before he was caught. Moscow has a huge population of wild dogs. There are hundreds of dogs that live in the metro stations, especially in colder months. A couple of dozen of them are so familiar with the train system that they've actually learned how to commute from one specific location to another. Smart wild dogs. Not all the wild dogs have learned such adorable tricks, though. Some are feral, nocturnal beasts scavenging in the woods at night for food, and the bodies of a number of Alexander's victims weren't found because they were instead eaten. Lovely. 5 days after the murder of the former police sergeant, Alexander struck again. He murdered 36-year-old Oleg Lavrenenko, and a week later he murdered Vladimir Dudakin, a 73-year-old disabled person. That was 3 murders in November, and Alexander would claim 4 more victims in December. 72-year-old Nikolai Korygin, 49-year-old Viktor Solyov, 64-year-old Boris Grishin, and 51-year-old Alexander Levichin. It was only a month since police realized there was a serial killer on the loose, and there were already 7 murders. 3 of those bodies were taken by feral dogs, so I suppose they only knew about 4, but that's still a whole lot for a month. No kidding. People were terrified, and the Bits Park maniac was no longer a silly urban legend. He was now a very real threat. By the end of 2005, most people were too terrified to even enter the park. There was a monster, or possibly monsters, lurking there. People weren't even sure if it was a single killer or a group working together. There were undercover police patrolling the park 24/7 and even helicopter surveillance. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the park is absolutely f***ing huge. There was no way to have eyes everywhere at all times. But it was still enough to deter Alexander from killing for the time being. However, he still went down to the park every single day, hoping to play some chess. His mother grew increasingly worried that he wasn't taking the presence of the murderer seriously, but he insisted on heading to the park for chess every single day, regardless of whether or not any of the other men he played with were going to show up. For a while, it seemed like the police presence was going to keep the Bits Park maniac from committing any more murders, but then, in February 2006, an arrest was made. Police stopped a crossdresser who was walking through the park, and they made a startling discovery. Inside the man's purse was a hammer. Is someone else about to go down for this? He was immediately arrested. The next day, all the papers ran the headlines about the Bits Park maniac finally having been caught. It turns out, though, the police were pretty confident that they'd got the wrong man within 24 hours of arrest, despite what the headlines had been publishing. He claimed to be carrying the hammer for protection, and he had airtight alibis for the murders. Even though the police were pretty sure they'd arrested him as a person, it took about a week to verify the alibis and officially clear his name. Yeah, also pro advice. If there's a guy murdering people with hammers in the park, don't carry a hammer in the park. People will think you are the murderer. Carry some sort of other defensive weapon. It's 2005. Get a taser. But that week was more than enough to piss Alexander off. He had spent years trying to become the most prolific murderer in Russian history, and now someone else was stealing the credit for all of his hard work. He couldn't let that stand, so he had to start leaving bodies again. Police presence be damned. On February 27, 2006, Alexander was finally able to lure 55-year-old Yuri Romashkin to his death. 5 days later, he murdered 57-year-old Steven Vasilchenko. At the end of March, he murdered 25-year-old Makhmud Zolashev. Makhmud was Alexander's 50th victim, and the 47th that he successfully murdered. The one that got away, and the one that got him caught. Finally, they're going to execute him, right? Yes, I'll send him to that black dolphin hellhole in Siberia. I don't know if you use the saying in the UK, Simon, but there's an old kernel of wisdom that has been passed down from generation to generation in the US. Don't shit where you eat. Yeah, I know exactly that one. Usually, this is meant as a warning against workplace romance, but it generally means to avoid doing reckless or illegal things at work, home, or anywhere else where a person regularly finds themselves. Yeah, it's about, screwing up your own environments. Don't do that. It's like shitting in the kitchen. Literally. In Alexander's case, this would mean not to attempt to sleep with or murder any of his co-workers, though we already know that he had broken that rule multiple times, and he wasn't sleeping with them. Ultimately, though, it was his refusal to stick to this rule that would lead to his downfall. In May 2005, the supermarket where Alexander worked hired a new woman for the meat department, Olga Sinyugina. She was a beautiful blonde who Alexander was immediately attracted to, so he decided to shoot his shot and ask her out. Olga was emphatically not interested, and she turned him down immediately. This infuriated Alexander, who wanted to exact his revenge. Like a f***ing incel. We already know that he preferred killing people that he knew, so what better a target than someone who had rejected his romantic advances? How about a better target would be someone who you don't have a motive against? There was an obvious problem, though. Olga had made it clear that she'd got zero interest in Alexander, so there was no chance they'd ever be able to get her to go into the woods a bit to park with him. Instead, He decided he was going to try something much more brazen. If he couldn't lure Olga into the woods, he'd just have to follow her home from work and murder her on the street. This required planning, though. The closest he had come to public murder was the man who'd tossed off the 16th story of a building, and murdering Olga on the street without getting caught would be challenging to say the least. Although he kept this plan in the back of his mind, he decided to continue killing safer targets in the woods for the time being until he could figure out how to successfully murder Olga without getting caught. At this point, I'll note that the main source for the story about Olga is the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is considered to be of questionable reliability because of its status as government propaganda. That said, the paper does have a number of respected journalists, and this story isn't political in nature, so I'm inclined to believe that it could be accurate. Just know that it comes from a potentially dubious source, so you can decide for yourself whether or not you think it's just tabloid fiction. On April the 11th, 2006, Alexander claimed his 51st victim, 48-year-old Larissa Kolagina. Larissa had recently started working at the grocery store with Alexander. Everyone in the grocery store is getting murdered. How big is this grocery store? This is surely the police. Come on. And on their date in question, their shift ended at exactly the same time. Larissa was outside the store struggling to light her cigarette, so Alexander offered her a light, and he began walking her home. As it turned out, they lived really close to each other, which meant that Larissa lived close to Bitzer Park as well. When they arrived at her house, she decided she wanted another cigarette before going inside, so Alexander invited her to take a walk with him in the park. Despite how dangerous the park was and people's reluctance to step inside it, Larissa likely believed that walking with Alexander would keep her safe from any would-be attackers. Yeah, he was a bit of a beast, wasn't he? So you'd be like, got a good strong man with me, it'll be fine. Except he is the murderer. It wasn't until they had strayed far into the woods away from other people that she realized she had been walking with the murderer all along, and her body was found in the same state as the others. Oh no! Oh, Larissa, I thought you were going to survive because this was titled The One That Got Away and the One That Got Him Caught. And I assumed that getting him caught meant you saw him, and now you're dead. Oh, I expected you to survive. That's so 2 months later, on June 14th, Alexander would claim his final victim, another woman with whom he worked. Dude, how, police? How? 36-year-old Marina Moskaliva had just started working at the store. Alexander had only met her the day before, but he invited her to a picnic in the park. She agreed, but was a little nervous about Bitzer Park as the location. Marina, who was a single mother, decided she should let her son Sergei know where she was going just in case. Her phone was dead, so she was unable to call him, but they stopped by her apartment instead so that she could leave a note. Marina wrote down Alexander's name and phone number so her son would know where she was and how to reach her, and then she and Alexander took the metro to the park to go for their walk. Alexander was well aware that she'd left this note behind, and he realized that her murder could be easily tracked back to him. He contemplated not going through with it out of self-preservation, but in the end, his desire to murder was too strong. Is this what gets him caught? Is it just this being this sloppy? Marina's body was found in the park the next day with a vodka bottle sticking out of her skull. Arrest and trial. When Marina hadn't returned home after a few hours, Sergei decided to call the number that his mother had left for him. Alexander answered the phone, told Sergei he hadn't seen his mother in months, and then hung up. This was a bizarre lie to tell, and many believed that Alexander's recklessness with Marina's murder was because he wanted to finally receive the credit for what he'd done. Yeah, I can see that. He's gradually moving to being more brazen, with the idea of being caught and getting the credit, because that's what he wants, because he's fucking insane. Police found Marina's body in the park, and Sergei was brought down to the station to identify the body. They had found a metro ticket in her pocket, and Sergei told them that she'd gone out for a walk with her boyfriend Sasha. Police searched the home, where they found the note Marina left, and they identified the phone number as being registered to 32-year-old Alexander Pichushkin, an employee at the same grocery store where Marina worked. Note that in Russian, the name Alexander is commonly shortened to Sasha rather than Alex. Okay, that makes sense. And he hadn't tried to lie about his identity to Marina or anything like that. Using the time stamped on the metro ticket found in Marina's pocket, police were able to find CCTV footage of her and Alexander walking through the station together. This, combined with the note she had left for her son, was enough to arrest Alexander for her murder. Finally! At around 10 p.m., June 16th, 2 days after he'd killed Marina, police swarmed the apartment complex where Alexander lived, banging on the door to be let in. They immediately went to Alexander's apartment, where his mother answered the door. Perhaps trying to spare her feelings for the time being, the police told her that her son was wanted in connection with a burglary. She didn't really believe this since her apartment was being flooded with teams of officers who had their guns drawn, but it was sweet of them to lie to her, I guess. Alexander was arrested, and inside the bedroom they found his hammer and the chessboard with 61 squares covered. Fragments found in the skull of one of his victims were matched to the handle of the hammer in his room. At first, despite the damning evidence, Alexander denied murdering Marina and refused to talk. But then he changed his mind. He would tell the police everything, but they had to grant him one request if they wanted him to talk. One version of the story is that he demanded a press conference to tell his story to the public, so police set up microphones and TV cameras and let him speak without broadcasting anything on TV. The other version is that he demanded a bottle of vodka and to speak to Olga Sinugina. He said that he had killed a lot of people and he wanted to tell her everything. In this version of the story, Olga was brought to the police station, where Alexander immediately jumped up from his chair and shouted at her, "You were supposed to be next. It's a pity I didn't make it in time." After listening to his confession, Olga then packed her bags and then moved with her family to Kazakhstan. Jesus, she's out. Again, the Olga thing is from a somewhat dubious source, but I figured I'd present both stories and you can believe whichever version you want. It does sound a little bit far-fetched, but also, I don't know, could have happened. Regardless of the demands surrounding his confession, the results of it were the same. The Bitzer Park maniac had been suspected of 14 murders, the 14 that took place once he started leaving the bodies out in the open. It wasn't until they interviewed Alexander and took his confession, however, that they understood the full extent of his crimes. Unaware that Maria had survived, he believed to have committed 61 murders, as evidenced by his chessboard. Police were skeptical of this number, though, since criminals love to exaggerate the extent of their crimes. Only once they're caught. Only once it's like, yeah, I'm going away for life. Yeah, okay, I murdered 61 people. Otherwise, they're like, didn't murder anyone. What are you talking about? It's either one side or the other, isn't it? However, because they weren't treated as criminal cases, the number of bodies that had shown up in sewage treatment plants had never been disclosed. After Alexander confessed to these murders in great detail, it was revealed that the bodies of 29 of his victims had shown up at the plants. And with these additional bodies, police began taking his claims more seriously. They believed that the 61 squares on the chessboard signified 61 crimes, but not that all of them were murders. Still, they needed more evidence than just Alexander's confession, because people give fake confessions all the time, especially when it comes to serial murder, which is bizarre, but it happens. A standard procedure in Russia in cases like this is to bring the accused to the scene of the crime and then film them attempting to reenact what they did. It's an effective method, as this can help display inconsistencies between the actual evidence and what the person is claiming in the event that it's a false confession for attention. On the other hand, it's not ideal when they are already convinced the person is guilty. They still have to go through with it because due diligence and all that, but criminals like Alexander absolutely get off on this shit. Despite their best efforts to prevent him from enjoying the reenactments, it was obvious that Alexander really enjoyed talking about his crimes and getting to act them out again. But some really important things did come from this. First, the elaborate confession helped solidify his guilt. Before Marina's murder, there had essentially been no evidence as to the killer's identity. Even though he left a vodka bottle embedded in the skulls of each victim, there were never any fingerprints on the bottles. He even had brushed away their shoe prints so that there was nothing to lead people to the bodies and no way to identify his shoes or anything. They did have the hammer fragments, but the level of detail with which Alexander was able to describe the crimes was too accurate to write off as a false confession. More importantly, he led them to the bodies that had not yet been discovered. While it was suspected that there were 14 murders in Bitzer Park since 2005, they hadn't found all 14 bodies. As I said, feral dogs got to some of them first. Alexander was able to lead police to the locations he had left these victims, where they found scattered skeletal remains. In total, he was charged with 49 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder for the 52 victims we discussed today. It wasn't the full number of victims he claimed to have taken, but it was all the ones that the police could prove. The trial began the following year. As Alexander was being led into the courthouse, he told the journalists that were there, "I will return to Bitsevsky Park. My hand remembers the hammer well." His defense line's just like, oh, for fuck's sake, why? I'm sure his defense attorney was thrilled with this statement. Yeah, you bet, Kevin. You and I, same page. Then again, there was only one way for this trial to go anyway. Alexander had confessed to everything, and he showed absolutely no remorse for any of his crimes, except for the murder of his friend Oleg. Throughout the trial, Alexander was kept inside a glass cage.
I'm in a glass case of emotion!
As had been done with Chikatilo during his trial. This was something that undoubtedly pleased Alexander, as he was open about his desire to break Chikatilo's record. But it wasn't nearly as special when it happened with Alexander. The point of the cage, made from bulletproof glass, was to protect the accused from spectators, not the other way around, as one might initially suspect. By this point, the use of cages was standard procedure in Russia for any trial involving a notorious criminal, though any similarity or comparison between Chikatilo and Alexander was likely appreciated by the lunatic. The rather open and shut trial lasted a month. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 hours. If Russian courts are anything like American courts, I suspect the deliberation lasted exactly as long as it would take for the jurors to get their free lunch, because there was absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that Alexander was guilty. He was convicted of all 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. He was given the opportunity to make a statement before being sentenced. Rather than showing remorse or begging for mercy, he instead implored the judge to increase his conviction to 60 murders in fairness to his other victims and their families. And I'm sure that was the real reason, not because Chikatilo was convicted of 52 murders, meaning that Alexander officially fell short of his goal. Unsurprisingly, the judge denied the request, but even though he only faced 49 convictions, the majority opinion seems to be that Alexander's personal count was accurate. Yeah, I believe him. Save for Maria. Yeah, because he didn't know. And that he is Russia's most prolific murderer in modern times. Unfortunately, the death penalty was not on the table. Oh no, Russia! It's Russia. Come on, what are you going to do? Come on! Even America's got the death penalty, Russia. Although technically capital punishment is still on the books in Russia, abolition of the death penalty is a requirement for joining the Council of Europe, though they will also accept a moratorium as they recognize laws take time to pass. No prisoner has been executed in Russia since they joined the council in 1996, at least not officially. As such, Alexander was sentenced to the harshest punishment available under Russian law, life in prison, with the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement. The solitary confinement would have ended 2 years ago, but there hasn't been any update on his status. Technically, he'll be eligible for parole soon, but there's basically a 0% chance this will be granted. Good. Deserves to die in prison. Deserves to die, to be honest, but if I can't get that, I'll take him rotting away in solitary for a decade and a half, and then prison forever. Throughout this time in prison, Alexander has repeatedly stated, if I were released now, the first thing I would do would be to kill a couple of people to relieve stress, sexually assault a woman, and drink vodka. So yes, I think it's pretty safe to assume that he's going to die in prison, where he belongs. At the end of the day, I think there are 2 important things that we can learn from today's episode. 3, if you count the fact that Alexander was a psychotic piece of shit who cannot possibly die soon enough. First, serfs are people too, so there was no chance he was ever going to become history's most prolific Russian killer. Second, and much more importantly, never let your small child play on a swing unsupervised. Jesus Christ, yeah, that swing just took him and made him a monster. Crazy. The brain is crazy, isn't it? Anyway, that's the end of the episode. Thanks for being here.